Few brands offer a wider product range than Mitsubishi. From huge SUVs and wild rally replica performance cars to this, the all-electric i-MIEV. This indeed was the very first proper all-electric model to make it to the UK market, and it's still the most affordable within the pricey realm that cars of this kind inhabit. Do your sums carefully though, and you may end up deciding that with everything added together over a typical ownership period, it's not very pricey at all. Mitsubishi's i-MIEV customers, after all, reckon that the future of motoring involves saving money as well as saving the planet. Let's see if they're right. Intelligent motion. Almost every mainstream automotive brand, it seems, has its own idea of what that little slogan means. For some, it's hybrid power. For others, hydrogen cell technology. Others still feel that there still remains much to do in pursuit of making conventional petrol and diesel engines that much more efficient. All, though, agree on one thing, that pure electric, fully electric vehicles have a major part to play in our motoring future. And the car we're going to look at here was the very first such vehicle to the mainstream market, Mitsubishi's i-MIEV. When in future years we look back on how full electric motoring first began, this is the car that will be wheeled out. Significant not only for the Japanese brand but also for Peugeot and Citroën, who both produce EV products based on exactly the same design. It's based on an existing conventional petrol-powered city car, the Mitsubishi i, introduced back in 2006. Itself originally created to suit Japanese K-car regulations, which promote smaller, more efficient vehicles in return for tax and insurance perks. An all-electric version was the ultimate K-car solution for Japan's smog-laden city streets. Whether it'll work as well in Western Europe is another question, of course, especially at the kind of prices currently being demanded by the necessary lithium-ion battery technology. This i-MIEV also faces tough competition, not only from its Peugeot and Citroën stablemates, but also from Nissan's all-electric Leaf model and the e-REV or extended range electric vehicles currently on offer from Vauxhall and Chevrolet. So this car is going to have to be good. Is it? We're about to find out. No one likes to be restricted in the way that they drive, and at first glance, buying into something that'll refuse to take you further than 93 miles without a potentially lengthy stop seems an uncomfortable prospect. But don't be put off. Almost no one buys an electric vehicle without something more conventional in the garage, and as long as you've got that, then the operating range becomes less of an issue. In any case, most of us tend to exaggerate the extent to which we use our vehicles. The facts are that the average UK motor car travels no more than about 20 miles a day and spends over 92% of its life being parked up. Recent surveys suggest that over 70% of journeys are under 16 miles in duration, and 40% of those are under 3 miles in length. So the idea of an electric car makes an awful lot of sense on paper, but in reality, can the transition from fuel to battery power really be as painless as Mitsubishi's marketing people would like us to believe? Well, with this i-MIEV, first impressions are positive on that score. No one's given me a second glance in the time I've been driving this car, understandably. From the outside, it does, after all, look pretty conventional, and nothing changes once you take a seat behind the wheel. You expect a wacky, futuristic interior from an all-electric car, instead of which there's this. Ordinary switchgear, an ordinary auto gearbox, and ordinary instruments. Well, at first glance anyway. Peer a little closer and you note that they aren't ordinary at all. Instead of a conventional speedo needle arcing around the digital MPH display, there's a needle that designates 3 coloured power meter zones. Keep it in the green eco zone and you'll be keeping to progress with minimal energy consumption. Put your foot down further and the needle will stray into the white zone, which denotes energy hungry driving. Slow significantly and the needle will drop back leftwards into the blue charge zone, where the battery will be recharging itself for a longer operating range. To the top left of the power meter is what looks like a fuel gauge, but actually denotes your remaining battery charge, which isn't much use unless you know how fast said charge is going to take you. For that, you have to look at the circular readout, the other side of the digital speedo. This LCD readout, you've got to scroll through the various options until you find that that gives you the range. It should be more prominent. There's a conventional key to fit into a conventional ignition. But there's nothing conventional about the silence that greets you after the ready chime when you twist it, or about the way that this car shoots away from rest. There's a standard D or drive mode, as with any auto, but you can also flip the lever down a couple of notches and access B or C options. What are they? Well, B increases the amount of regenerative braking that you get, so the vehicle will harvest more energy as it slows down, so extending its operating range. It'll also make the car more controllable going down steep hills. C, on the other hand, is a drive mode that will actually reduce the amount of regenerative braking, so aiding more relaxed cruising on the open road. I'd guess, though, that most owners will probably just leave the gear stick in D and forget about the other two options, which is probably why the Peugeot and Citroën versions of this car dispense with B and C entirely. Because all 180 Newton meters of torque is thrust onto the tarmac from the word go, from rest to 30 miles an hour, this car actually does feel very rapid, quicker actually than your average hot hatch. But progress slows as the revs rise, culminating in a 0 to 60 mile an hour time that's no better, but certainly no worse, than your average petrol-powered city car at around 16 seconds. With 64 brake horsepower on tap, there's a top speed of about 80 miles an hour and enough overtaking punch to get from 37 to 56 miles an hour in around about 6 seconds. But approach either of those figures on a regular basis and you'll find the range indicator here on the dash dropping like a stone. And this is going to be a pretty important dial for you to be looking at. You're going to be staring at it rather a lot because it's going to determine exactly how and when you can use this i-MIEV. As with the Peugeot and Citroën versions of this car, the designers quote an operating range of 93 miles. But that's a figure that seems to have been calculated on the basis of someone motoring very slowly indeed. I've certainly never seen anything like that amount of projected mileage on the readout in my time with this car. But that's because the computer driving the readout bases its calculations on previous use, so artificially lowering a range figure which can then be extended by driving carefully. Limited use of the aircon and the heating will also help. You know this in your head, but if, as I did the other morning, you come out to do a 50-mile round trip with 56 miles showing on the range indicator, it's a worry in the back of your mind you could do without. Or at least it is today. In the future, when so-called rapid charging points spring up around the country, then use of cars of this kind will of course become a lot more flexible. A rapid charging point will be able to replenish up to 50% of your battery's capacity in just 15 minutes, or up to 80% in just 30 minutes. But there aren't that many of those around. For the time being, most of the charging points that are available are of the fast or of the slow variety, and these both take a fair bit longer. The few fast charging points that are around use a single or three-phase 32 amp supply to charge you from empty in 3 to 4 hours. But most points that you'll find will be of the so-called slow charging variety, plugging into which will be just like plugging in at home to an ordinary 13 amp 240 volt supply, and that'll take about 7 hours from empty, and you'll pay probably just under £2 in electricity cost to charge your battery completely. Now, a few extra points that you may have wondered about. No, you won't come back from holiday to find your battery flat. The battery doesn't leak charge over time to any great extent. No, you won't find yourself driving off with the lead still inadvertently attached because the ignition system doesn't work when it's all connected up. And there's also no problem with just topping up the battery. You don't have to completely take all the charge out of it before topping up, as you had to with older style batteries. The standard package doesn't include the kind of useful sat-nav system you'll find on something like a Nissan Leaf, which when you're out and about will direct you to where your nearest charging point is. But you'll very quickly pick that up from a scan of the internet through sites like www.ev-network.org.uk. An even better one I've found is www.nextgreencar.com, where there's not only a map showing all the charging points, but one that also designates what kind of charging points those are, whether they're rapid, fast or slow. Specifically, you'll find the map on www.nextgreencar.com/electric-vehicles/charging-points.php, which is where I've been in order to direct myself to my local charging point, which is just about here. Now, to get your car on charge somewhere like this, you're going to need a smart card, which you can buy from your local council. Now, they cost around £50 upwards, depending on what part of the country you're in. An annual fee that usually covers the electricity that you'll be using. Buy one of these, and you can use points of this kind as often as you want. Some councils include free parking too, but mine doesn't. And they've only included a slow charger that'll be just like plugging in at home. So all I'm going to be able to do now while going to get a bit of shopping is get a bit of a top up. Still worth having, particularly as connecting everything up is so mess and hassle free. The i-MIEV has two charging flaps, one on each side at the rear. Now, one is for a rapid charging lead, for those times when you are fortunate enough to find a rapid charging point. But most of the time, when you're at home or when you're out and about, you're going to be plugging into a fast, or in this case, a slow charging point, in which case you're going to be using the flap here. It releases just like a petrol flap, so that you can very quickly and easily plug in. Then swipe your council smart card on the charging point so that the flap lifts up and you can plug in your 3-point plug into the socket. After that, off you go. It's as simple as that. Now, let's say I've finished my business meeting or my shopping and I'm ready to unplug again and trundle off in eerie silence into the urban environment, which is, of course, this car's preferred habitat. Like its other EV rivals, this one's 47 kilowatt synchronous electric motor makes no noise whatsoever, which can in itself be a bit of a menace to dozy pedestrians or the partially sighted who aren't alerted to its presence as they would be by the artificial noise created for safety purposes by a rival Nissan Leaf. So you'll need to have your wits about you when inching down congested city streets or when manoeuvring around tight car parks, which is when this car's tight 9-metre turning circle, compact dimensions and great all-round visibility all come into their own, as does the finger-light power steering. Leave the city limits though, and that same lightness at the helm is less welcome. But handling is better than the tall stance and skinny tyres might lead you to expect, thanks to the way that the heavy 240 kilogram 88 cell 16 kilowatt lithium-ion battery pack has been strategically placed under the centre of the car to give a low centre of gravity and balanced stability. Heavy side winds and the wake from turbulent HGVs can upset things a bit though, and there's plenty of tyre noise. But probably the most abiding memory you take away from with you after driving this car is how little you have to use the brakes. Approach a junction, a corner or a roundabout, and if you're having to slow down a lot, if you've got the drive lever in D or even better in B, the regenerative braking does most of the slowing down for you, replenishing the battery energy as it goes. Such is the cleverness of modern technology. The i-MIEV is an electric version of the Mitsubishi i-City car, a design dating back to 2006. Fortunate then that the looks of the original model were futuristic, meaning that this one doesn't look in any way dated. It's clearly a little sub-super mini city car, if a rather high-sided one. At around 3.5 metres in length, it's more akin to a tiny hatch like a Peugeot 107 or a Citroën C1 in size than a Fiesta-shaped Super Mini, though as we'll see, the 1.6 metres of height make it feel bigger than the tiniest urban runabouts inside. Having to base this thing around a little city car wasn't ideal for Mitsubishi, whereas rivals Nissan can point to a relatively small price gap between a top-spec diesel Focus-sized family hatchback like their comparably sized all-electric Leaf model. Mitsubishi acknowledged that there's a yawning price differential between the cost of a conventional little hatch like their Colt Super Mini and this i-MIEV. But they do point out that within the confines of this car's compact dimensions, it offers a surprising amount of space. This is where you realise just how quickly the Japanese pick things up. The very first i-MIEV models felt cheap and plasticky inside in a way that European buyers would have objected to. When Peugeot came to launch their version of this car, they improved upon things in the cabin a great deal, and Mitsubishi were watching closely, then incorporating most of the French brand's improvements into this model and actually improving upon them in many areas, with features like this lovely but sadly optional stitched leather dashboard trim. But what's it like in the back? Well, as Mitsubishi suggests, it really does feel quite airy in here. Certainly it's narrow, but then you'd expect that given that this car is less than 1.6 metres in width. The main thing is that the transition from petrol to battery power has been done in such a way that there are almost no compromises in passenger space. So the electric motor sits under this seat here, and the battery pack sits under the floor in place of the fuel tank. As a result, two adults will be quite comfortable back here in the kind of short to medium journeys that this car will be making. I'd say even that 3 children could sit here on shorter journeys, or at least they could if Mitsubishi had provided 3 sets of seat belts. Unfortunately, there's only 2, which will be a bit irritating for some families. At the wheel, it feels surprisingly spacious too. You sit quite high, which isn't a bad thing in an urban setting, surrounded by sensible ergonomics and excellent all-round visibility. You shouldn't, of course, expect the standards of fit and finish that you get in the kind of executive car for which you pay a comparable amount. That would be unrealistic. This car's battery pack, after all, accounts for almost 2/3 of its asking price. Taking a seat here for the first time, the only real clue that the uninitiated would get that this was anything other than a conventional petrol-powered city car is the fact that on the fuel display on the dash there's a petrol pump with, rather oddly, an electric plug hanging out of it. Boot space isn't huge, but despite the need to accommodate all those batteries under the floor, the room that you get at 170 litres is 40 litres more than you get in a conventional city car like a Peugeot 107. And you can make good use of it by angling these rear backrests forward. And of course, if you need more space, you can push them flat completely. The proposition here is simple but expensive, or apparently so. If you were to buy this car outright, you'd be looking at an asking price of at least, well, £24,000 upwards. And that's after you've subtracted the £5,000 government subsidy that's available on electric cars of this kind. It's an embarrassingly high figure for a city car, which is why those prospective customers fortunate enough to find one of the few Mitsubishi dealers able to sell one of these will usually be directed towards a lease. Now, these can often include virtually everything apart from your minimal electricity charging costs. They'll still be expensive, at least will still be costly, but from it you've to subtract the massive savings you'll be making not only in fuel, road fund, licence and maintenance, but also in the complete deletion of company car tax. Now, take off that little lot from your operating budget and ownership of one of these EV vehicles can suddenly start to look very affordable indeed. As for pure electric rivals, well, the two most obvious ones that spring to mind that share this design are Citroen's C0 and Peugeot's Ion, but they're significantly pricier. Mini and Smart also make full electric models, but they're smaller 3-door cars. If you want 5 doors, then the most obvious all-electric competitor that will spring to mind will probably be Nissan's Leaf. Now that's a slightly bigger Focus-size family hatchback-shaped model, but it is quirkily styled and several £1,000s more expensive. But in looking at this car, you won't only be considering the all-electric alternatives. In fact, there are no fewer than 4 other categories of car that you could bear in mind. The first covers the so-called e-REV models, that acronym standing for Extended Range Electric Vehicles. What are they? Well, cars like Vauxhall's Ampera and Chevrolet's Volt that back up the electric motor with an emergency use only petrol power plant so that you'll never run out of fuel. Sounds a good idea, doesn't it? But there are downsides here too. The main one being that with an e-REV, the electric operating range falls from the 93 miles that you get in one of these to no more than 30 to 50 miles, which means that you could end up running an awful lot of the time on petrol power. And that seems to kind of defeat the point of buying an electric vehicle in the first place. The other 3 conceivable options for potential i-MIEV buyers are slightly more conventional ones. The first group concerns hybrids, petrol-electric hybrids, where the electric motor dips in and out of the engine as needed. Now, you can't buy a conventional hybrid quite as small as this, but Toyota and Honda do make hybrid versions of their Yaris and Jazz Super Minis, as well as slightly larger family hatchback-shaped hybrid models, the Toyota Yaris HSD and the Honda Insight. But these are pricey. They cost £15,000 to £20,000 to buy, which means that over a typical ownership period, when you take the all-electric savings of tax, fuel and maintenance into account, they'll end up costing you more to run than an i-MIEV. Next up are pricier hybrids with so-called plug-in capability, generally based on larger family hatchback-shaped models. Now here, as with a pure electric car, the batteries can be charged up from your main socket overnight, rather than just by the engine. And that's an approach that cuts their quoted emissions levels in half. Toyota's Prius bases this concept on petrol power, whilst with Peugeot's 3008 you can have it mated to a diesel. But the problem with cars of this kind is that they're as pricey, if not more expensive, than an all-electric alternative. And plug-in hybrids, frugal as they are, can't match all-electric costs, even if they are more flexible in day-to-day use. All of which explains why it probably makes more sense to compare this car to a conventional small petrol runabout, like Mitsubishi's own Colt. The fact that the i-MIEV will be 2.5 times pricier will make the electric option seem much the more expensive, though, as we'll see in our cost of ownership section, that might not necessarily be the case. For many, though, it'll come down to green friendliness. Just how far are you prepared to go in saving the planet? If you have carefully considered all of the options on offer and decided to buy an i-MIEV, then at least you won't be further burdened by having to trawl through a complicated model range. There's only one main variant on offer, and it comes with 15-inch alloy wheels, front fog lights, air conditioning, a decent quality CD stereo, power folding mirrors, a height adjustable driver's seat, leather trim for the steering wheel and gear knob, a 12-volt power socket and a trip computer. You don't get satellite navigation in the standard Tally, but it is on the options list, which for such an expensive city-orientated car is slightly curious. Other options are limited to things like body styling kits and roof racks. Safety tally, well, that runs to 6 airbags, ESP stability control, ISOFIX child seat fastenings, and the usual electronic aids for braking and traction. So, running a pure electric car will be cheap, just 3 pence per mile, as opposed to about 11 pence per mile for a conventional diesel-powered city car and about 16 pence per mile for a conventional petrol-powered city car. But then you probably already guessed that, didn't you? The real issue here is whether the sums can financially add up when you take the high purchase price into account. Well, first of all, the sums are going to look a lot rosier if you're considering this vehicle from a company or a business perspective, if you're going to be buying it as a business tool, or you're going to be leasing it as an alternative to a conventional company car. With VAT reclaimable on leasing fees and no company car tax whatsoever, it is on this basis pretty easy to build a financial argument for almost any electric vehicle. But here we're going to look at the worst case private buying scenario. Now, though you could buy this car outright, you'd need to budget at least £24,000. Most customers will be getting one on a lease, either a business or a personal lease. And as for the cost of one of those, it depends inevitably on the duration of the agreement and the mileage you commit to cover. To give you some idea, I've done a bit of homework on your behalf. In late 2011, such a lease over 4 years at 10,000 miles a year on Mitsubishi finance without maintenance would have set you back £279 excluding VAT a month, with a 6-month deposit up front and 47 further payments. That's about £100 more a month than it would have cost for a conventional petrol-powered Colt CZ1 Super Mini. Now, to save you doing the maths, over 4 years, that kind of lease would have set you back a total of £14,787, excluding the VAT, or £17,744 if you couldn't reclaim VAT. Now, on top of that figure, your major costs are fairly minimal. There's no significant maintenance costs, there's no engine, you see. So you're really only looking at recharging costs, which in an i-MIEV will set you back about £2.50 for every 120 miles. So over the 40,000 miles of this typical 4-year lease, you'd be looking at paying £833 in recharging costs. Add that to the total leasing figure that I just gave you, and you're looking at a total of £18,577, including the VAT all in, plus maybe a set of tyres. Now, if that sounds a lot, then compare that to the kind of outlay, realistically, that you'd be looking at spending on a conventional petrol-powered city car. Get one of those for a typical price of around £10,000 and run it for the same 4-year, 40,000 mile duration as this Mitsubishi, and you'd be shelling out around £6,000 in fuel costs. That's based on £6 a gallon and an average of 40 mpg. On top of that, you probably spend around £4,000 in maintenance, a grand total of £20,000, around £1,500 more than you'd have paid to run this i-MIEV. Now, of course, with the conventional city car, you'd have a car to sell or to part exchange at the end of that period, but it probably wouldn't be worth that much. So this Mitsubishi's electric proposition all begins to make sense, doesn't it? Even if you don't give two hoots about the planet. And the savings become guaranteed when you take account of the fact that with this car there's no need to buy a road fund license disc. In many cities you won't be charged for parking, which will save urban dwellers a fortune. In Westminster, for example, around £2,000 a year. And it also removes any need to pay the London congestion charge, which if you were going into London every day would save you around £2,500 a year. And it gets better still if you then start to consider the tax implications. For companies, there's 100% first-year capital allowance write-down for business use, but let's focus here on the personal taxation advantages. If I were to opt for this as my company car, rather than something typical like, say, a Vauxhall Astra 2-litre CDTI SE Auto, I'd find around £300 more in my pay packet each month. In savings in company car tax. That's like being given a £3,600 annual rise. As for the other issues you'll need to be aware of when running an i-MIEV, well, for a start, you'll need to know that not every Mitsubishi dealership will be able to service the thing. By the end of 2011, just a handful had been appointed, which might not necessarily be a problem unless your local stockist isn't close. As for insurance, well, at Group 27, you're looking at spending out a fair bit more than you would to insure a normal petrol-powered city car, although that grouping is slightly better than the one applied to the Peugeot and Citroën versions of this car. What about battery longevity? Well, it is true that after 5 years, you might be down to about 80% of the original battery charge capability. But of course, by that time, most owners would have traded in their car for another one. Nevertheless, it might affect resale values. In terms of warranty, you're looking at a 3-year warranty, just as you get on pretty much any other Mitsubishi, and that is less than Peugeot and Citroën offer on their versions of this car. Plug this car in at home and the overnight charging time will be about 7 hours. But what kind of charge will that be? If you're buying this car for green eco reasons, it's worth bearing in mind what the source of your electricity is. After all, if you're drawing your power from a filthy coal-fired power station, then your green credentials are going to be severely dented. If, on the other hand, your electricity provider uses a gas power station, or even better, a nuclear power station, or one that uses renewable energy, then things are going to look much more green and rosy. Now, to give you an idea of how much difference this makes, if you draw your power to recharge this car from the national grid from a normal power station, it puts out the equivalent of 44 grams per kilometre of CO2, bearing in mind where the electricity has come from. If, on the other hand, the power to charge this Mitsubishi comes from a station that uses nuclear power, then that figure would fall to 25 grams per kilometre of CO2. Suppliers like EDF Energy will use nuclear power very often. Some electricity suppliers also offer a so-called green tariff, where they guarantee that for every unit of electricity you purchase, they will draw a stated percentage of renewable energy to furnish your needs. Now, going the green tariff route will almost certainly cost you a little more, but you'll have the peace of mind of knowing that you'll be helping your energy supplier participate in renewable energy projects, and therefore safeguarding the future of sustainable energy. There aren't many cars these days that live up to their names, but this one does. i-MIEV stands for Mitsubishi Innovative Electric Vehicle, and this is certainly that. It was the first pure electric vehicle of its type, and it remains one of the best, primarily because it's also the most affordable. With a Peugeot Ion, a Citroën C0 or a Nissan Leaf, it can be a struggle to justify the all-electric benefits in view of the high leasing or outright purchase costs involved. With this model, that's much easier to do. Of course, you're going to need to be embarking upon your electric adventure with your eyes wide open. You'll need a garage for charging, naturally, and a more conventional car for longer trips. But I reckon if you owned an i-MIEV, you'd be surprised by just how often you used it, by just how enjoyable it was to drive, and just how quickly you were able to justify the upfront outlay. In fact, I think you'd be surprised all round. New technology has a way of delivering that, doesn't it?